Tonight we continue our study of the Old Testament prophets and their prophecies and how they apply to our lives today and how they can impact us today as well. And so tonight we're looking at the first and the last chapter of Obadiah. Obadiah is the shortest book in the Old Testament, and there is only one chapter in this book. And so we'll be looking at this entire chapter tonight. But you have to remember, it's been a few weeks since we last met and discussed Obadiah and who he was writing about and who he was writing to. But remember that he was prophesying against the Edomites. And the Edomites are the descendants of Esau who were attacking Israel from time to time. Jacob and Esau, or Israel, as Jacob's name was later changed to, Israel and Esau battled inside of the womb. They were twins. They fought while they were alive, and their ancestors fought for 2 millennia. And so for 2,000 years, these two family groups, these two people groups, waged war against each other. They were never content, but nevertheless, what we see is that Obadiah, during his day, is writing a prophecy against Esau's descendants, against Edom. And as we begin to look at Obadiah's writing, we see the very purpose of God's prophecy, and we see that it is to humble the Edomites. Look in verse 2 with me. He says in verse 2, "See, I will make you small among the nations. You will be utterly despised." And so basically what the purpose of this prophecy against the Edomites is all about is to humble them. And we see there he says he's going to make them small among the nations. There's nothing proud about being a small nation amongst bigger nations. Their people group would have been a small one. But more importantly, the last phrase he says there, you will be utterly despised. And he's pointing out that they would not be favored by anyone. And really what this points to is the downfall of Edom. That's what he's pointing at. That's what he's talking all about. And we read about this in verses 3 through 9. So follow along with me and we'll read this together and then we'll break it down. It says, beginning in verse 3, "The pride of your heart has deceived you, you who live in the clefts of the rocks and make your home on the heights, you who say to yourself, who can bring me down to the ground? Though you soar like the eagle and make your nest among the stars, from there I will bring you down, declares the Lord. If thieves came to you, if robbers in the night, oh, what a disaster awaits you. Would they not steal only as much as they wanted? If grape pickers came to you, would they not leave a few grapes? But how Esau will be ransacked, his hidden treasures pillaged. All your allies will force you to the border. Your friends will deceive and overpower you. Those who eat your bread will set a trap for you, but you will not detect it. In that day, declares the Lord, will I not destroy the wise men of Edom, those of understanding in the mountains of Esau. Your warriors, Teman, will be terrified, and everyone in Esau's mountains will be cut down in the slaughter." Pretty descriptive recording of the downfall of Edom by Obadiah years and years before it would actually happen. And he does a great job of sharing that with us. You know, it's kind of interesting the way that Obadiah writes, because he writes much like a preacher is forced to preach. And that is because many people don't realize a little known fact about preaching, and I may have mentioned it to you before. But when it comes to preaching, did you know it's harder to preach a 15 or 20 minute sermon than it is a 30, 35, 45 minute sermon? And the reason for that is the less time you have to unpack everything, the less you have time to waste, I think is the best way to put it. And not that it's wasted, but you have to be more concise in what you share. You have to be more deliberate in what you say in those 15 or 20 minutes than you would in a whole 30 minutes if you did a sermon that long. And so you don't have time to waste or the time to elaborate. So in these short messages, you get to the point and you do so very quickly. And really, Obadiah did exactly that. This book, I told you a minute ago, it's the shortest book in the Old Testament. And it only has 21 verses of text in it. And he didn't waste any time reciting Israel and Esau's background and their feuding and their fighting or anything like that. He immediately got down to brass tacks and jumped right into what needed to be discussed. And he tells in the first 8 words of verse 3 the sin that had led Edom to their downfall. And he says that sin was pride. He says the pride of your heart has deceived you. And so he's telling them that their downfall is based in their sin of pride. And Edom, as we know from world history and from what the scriptures help to paint the picture of for us just a little bit, we know that Edom was situated on a prime trade route south of Jerusalem, south of Israel. And it was on the King's Highway. And basically this was their modern day, or their major trade routes between Syria and Egypt. And because of that, it put them on prime real estate. We all understand how that would be. They grew very wealthy by imposing taxes and even robbing the occasional caravans. They would do whatever they needed to, and then they would retreat to their strategic positions in their cities high up in the mountains of Edom. And they would go up there, and they were hard to defeat because of that. And so they felt invincible. They felt like they could not be defeated because they could come and go as they pleased. They could do what they wanted. And they became very prideful because of the wealth they were amassing and because of their strategic position. They felt like nobody could touch them. And so they felt like they were doing real well. And their pride got in the way of what they were supposed to be doing. And so their pride would eventually not save them from God's judgment. And so God had judgment planned for the people of Edom, and he shares that through Obadiah. And in verses 4 through 6 here, Obadiah tells Edom, he warns the descendants of Esau, he tells them in no uncertain terms that they would be brought low, that they would be humbled. They're going to come from this position of pride and exaltation to a very low, humble place. They were going to be brought low. And Obadiah tells Edom exactly how it's going to happen, exactly what God is going to use to humble them, to get rid of this pride issue with them. And he says there in verse 7, one thing he's going to use is their allies and friends. So he's going to use their allies and their friends to humble them. He was also going to use their elders, and the fact that their elders of Edom, the leaders of the people of Edom, were going to be destroyed. And so all of a sudden their leadership, their elders, were not going to be there. Something was going to happen. Somehow they were going to be destroyed, and they would not have any leadership. And so their allies are going to attack them or be against them. They're not going to have any leadership. And then finally in verse 9, Obadiah tells them that their soldiers will be defeated. And so all of a sudden things have gone from bad to worse to, oh no, things are really, really bad. For the people of Edom, because what has happened is they've started to lose those things that helped to provide them with that security that they felt. They had allies and friends. Well, now our friends and allies have turned on them, and then they've lost their leadership. So now their soldiers have been defeated, and so while allies are attacking them, they have no leadership, and they have no soldiers to defend them. Edom is set up to be humbled. They're being set up right here in the midst of this to be brought low from that point of pride that they found themselves in. But see, verses 10 through 14 gives us the reasons for this downfall from pride. Look at verses 10 through 14. We'll read them and look at and break them down as well. It says in verse 10, because of the violence against your brother Jacob, you will be covered with shame. You will be destroyed forever. On the day you stood aloof while strangers carried off his wealth and foreigners entered his gates and cast lots for Jerusalem, you were like one of them. You should not gloat over your brother in the day of his misfortune, nor rejoice over the people of Judah in the day of their destruction, nor boast so much in the day of their trouble. You should not march through the gates of my people in the day of their disaster, nor gloat over them in their calamity in the day of their disaster, nor seize their wealth in the day of their disaster. You should not wait at the crossroads to cut down their fugitives, nor hand over their survivors in the day of their trouble. See, the Edomites were told back in verses 3 and 4 that they would be humbled. They were told that they would be humbled because of their sinful pride. And now Obadiah is telling them the reason for their downfall. He's telling them the reason for their downfall was because of their treatment of their brother or Israel. And so we see that the real reason for their downfall is brought on by the pride that they had. They felt prideful. They felt like they were superior to Israel, so they could treat Israel however they wanted to. And because of that poor treatment of Israel, God is going to bring this downfall on them. And so verse 10 highlights this by pointing out what Edom did and what will happen to them. If you look at verse 10, it says, "For violence against your brother Jacob, shame shall cover you, and you shall be cut off forever." You know, that's one way that it's phrased there in verse 10. And to figure out what kind of violence Edom was committing, you didn't have to look very far. I mean, they were being violent against Israel, and because of that, they were going to be cut off forever. If you remember from the last time we talked about the introductory information about Obadiah, what ends up happening is at some point in world history, and we'll talk about it as we wrap up tonight, there is a point in world history where there is a nation of Edom, and then shortly after that, there is no nation of Edom. Why is that? They've been wiped out forever, just as God prophesied through Obadiah. But see, in verses 11 through 14, this is where we see about the violence that Edom was directing towards Israel, towards their family, towards their cousins, so to speak. But we see that the outline in verses 11 through 14 tell us what Edom was doing that God found so wrong. Rather than helping their brother, Edom watched as attackers carried off Israel's wealth. You know, Misty and I have watched our boys grow, and they've been like a lot of brothers or siblings have been throughout the years that, you know, they can argue and fuss and fight, but if somebody else steps into the mix and starts to pick or fight or fuss with brother or sister or whoever it is, that other sibling's going to step up and be like, "Look, you ain't going to mess with my brother or my sister or whatever," and get into the scrap there with them and do that defense. Well, even though Esau and Israel had been butting heads for millennia, for 2,000 years they fought like brothers and sisters do. When the other person came into the mix and was picking on Israel, was looting and defeating Israel, rather than doing what God says they should have done, instead of Esau jumping into the mix and saying, "Look, you ain't going to mess with these people. They're family. You know, I might fight with them, but you surely can't." Instead of doing that, Esau stands back and sort of, "Oh, look what happened to you. Oh, you just got it handed to you. You just got looted and pillaged and defeated." And so God's calling them out over this. Rather than jumping in and helping and defending them, they were watching and allowing it to happen. They were watching people attack Israel, watching people carry off the stuff that had been brought into Jerusalem that had been dedicated to God. And in God's eyes, Edom might as well have been the ones carrying off the loot. If they're going to stand there and gloat, stand there and make fun and to watch as this happens, God said they're basically as guilty as the ones actually carrying off the loot. And Edom did do that. They gloated over Israel's defeat and their destruction. And they were guilty of coming in right after Israel had been defeated and destroyed, and they came in and would loot Jerusalem. They came in and looted Israel as if they were one of the attackers. They were basically the scavengers picking up after the attack was over. And verse 14 points out what Edom did during Nebuchadnezzar's attack on Jerusalem. When basically what happened is when Nebuchadnezzar ransacked the city of Jerusalem and started to take people from Jerusalem back to Babylon, like Daniel and Ezra and those captives from Jerusalem and from Israel to Babylon, what happened was some of them, before they were captured, tried to head south. They tried to get away. They tried to run away from the Babylonians. And so as they're heading down the King's Highway, making a beeline for family land, so to speak, to see family and get away from the Babylonians, the Edomites throw up a big stop sign and they say, whoa, whoa, whoa. No, you ain't coming this way. They captured them and then took them back and handed them over to the Babylonians. And so they were, the Edomites, it wasn't just a matter of a family feud over a disagreement about a birthright or a blessing or anything like that. This is cutthroat actions of the Edomites towards the Israelites. And basically that's what they did. When all of this was over and Nebuchadnezzar takes Daniel and all of the captives back to Babylon, the Edomites roll into Jerusalem and loot and pillage again the city of Jerusalem and pick up the table scraps that Nebuchadnezzar leaves behind. And that was how they were not coming to the defense of Israel. Instead, they were just like the ones who were attacking them. But see, in verses 15 through 16, we see that Obadiah tells us about the near and future downfall of Edom. Look at verses 15 and 16 with me again. It says, "The day of the Lord is near for all nations. As you have done, it will be done to you. Your deeds will return upon your own head. Just as you drank on my holy hill, so all the nations will drink continually. They will drink and be as if they had never been." So right here we see that Obadiah is pointing to two different judgments of the people of Edom. And like many prophets, we see that Obadiah mentions the day of the Lord in his prophecy. We first were introduced to that when we studied Joel back a few months ago. But we see that he mentions the day of the Lord, and we know what that is. We know that the day of the Lord is the day of judgment that is going to happen according to the book of Revelation. We know that it will happen after the 7 years of the tribulation. I don't have my usual timeline to show you, but the next event in the prophetic calendar of the Bible is the rapture. After the rapture is 7 years of literally hell on earth, because things go from bad to really bad. I mean, it gets worse and worse and worse. I mean, large segments of the population, millions and billions of people die, and it's really bad. After those 7 years of the tribulation, after that time period, we have what we refer to as the glorious appearing. That is the return of Christ. We think of it as Jesus returning on the clouds, and that is the glorious appearing. And when that happens, Jesus comes back to set up his millennial kingdom, his 1,000-year reign. And when that happens, when he comes back at that glorious appearing, that is when that day of the Lord will happen. That's when that judgment will occur. And so that's what Obadiah and Joel and all these other prophets are describing. And here in verses 15 and 16, Obadiah points out that Edom will be judged in the very near future and into the distant future. See, he says in the very near future, he says, "As you have done, it will be done to you. Your deeds will return upon your own head." And this would be only a few hundred years after Obadiah writes. So he's telling them, look, here in the very near future, you're going to be judged. And things are going to go very badly for you. But also, in the day of the Lord, as we know it to be more than 2,000 years after, at least 2,000 years after Edom is originally punished, we see that this is going to happen again. And that's what Obadiah is pointing out, is that in that day of the Lord, when Christ returns, which has not happened yet, we see that they will be judged just like that. And on the day of the Lord, Edom will be like all the other nations, being judged by God when Christ returns. And although Edom is no longer a political, governmental group of people, although there is not a people group that you can go over to the Middle East and say, oh, these are the Edomites. Even though you can't do that anymore, those descendants of Esau, who are Edomites by blood and don't even realize it, they will be judged just like everybody else, all other nations in the world, when it comes to the judgment that God has on the day of the Lord. On the day of judgment at the end times, it doesn't matter whether you're an Edomite, it doesn't matter whether you're an Israelite, it doesn't matter whether you're an American, it doesn't matter whether you're Russian or Syrian or whatever. You will be judged if you do not have a relationship with Christ. And the reason for that is that's what that judgment is all about. And so they'll be judged the Edomites will be judged just like any other nationality, just like any other person who does not have a relationship with Christ during that judgment. But through God's destruction of Edom, we see that God delivers Zion. And we read this in the last few verses of this chapter. We read this in verses 17 through 21. It says, But on Mount Zion will be deliverance. It will be holy, and Jacob will possess his inheritance. Jacob will be a fire, and Joseph a flame. Esau will be stubble, and they will set him on fire and destroy him. There will be no survivors from Esau. The Lord has spoken. People from the Negev, and the Negev is southern Israel, where Edom was at. Okay, that's the hill country in the lower portion of Israel, and this is where Edom was at. Or the area right above, I guess I should say, Edom. It says, people from the Negev will occupy the mountains of Esau, and people from the foothills will possess the land of the Philistines. They will occupy the fields of Ephraim and Samaria, and Benjamin will possess Gilead. This company of Israel exiles who are in Canaan will possess the land as far as Zarephath. The exiles from Jerusalem who are in Sepharad will possess the towns of the Negev. Deliverers will go up on Mount Zion, which is Jerusalem, to govern the mountains of Esau, and the kingdom will be the Lord's. See, God promises right here to deliver Israel through all that they face. Whether it was attacks from the Philistines, the Arabs, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, or even the Edomites, God was promising to deliver them. And that God would allow Israel to once again take back the land that they had while Esau would be displaced. Basically, Obadiah was saying, look, the land that Edom has been controlling just south of Israel, it's not going to be theirs anymore. It's going to be for the Israelites. And so God is telling them that they would once again control that land. And Israel would eventually have a hand in defeating Edom. And this occurred 500 years after Obadiah wrote. Because what ends up happening is the people of Israel would not only once again inhabit the promised land, they would also spread out into the lands previously occupied by the Philistines, by the Edomites, and by others. And so during this time they took over that land. But Obadiah closes his prophecy, his one chapter in the Bible, with encouraging words for Israel after 2,000 years of feuding with the Edomites. He says there in verse 21, he says, Deliverers will go up on Mount Zion to govern the mountains of Esau, and the kingdom will be the Lord's. Basically what we see here is that God is telling them, look, those that will rule over the land of Edom will be in Jerusalem. And the Israelites knew that that would be them, that it wouldn't be anybody else. So they were being told, they were being guaranteed that they would be in control of the land of Edom. But not only that, more importantly, that the kingdom that would be established would be God's, that it would be the Lord's kingdom. And from world history, we know that part of Obadiah's prophecy has already occurred. That near judgment that he described earlier has already been fulfilled, because roughly 850 years after Obadiah wrote his prophecy, the zealots in Israel were trying to overthrow the Roman government that was occupying Jerusalem and Israel. And so they basically asked for help from Edom and asked them to come and help defeat to basically run the Romans out of Jerusalem and out of Israel. And I guess the Edomites thought that if they were successful in pushing the Romans out of Jerusalem and Israel, they could do the same with Edom. And what happened was 20,000 Edomites left their land south of Israel and flooded into Jerusalem. And it basically complicated the issue that the Israelites were trying to bring about when they were trying to defeat the Romans. And so what ended up happening is Rome destroyed the temple, Rome destroyed Jerusalem, and Rome destroyed the Edomite people. After 70 AD, there is no reference to the Edomite people in world history because they were destroyed in Jerusalem when the temple was destroyed. And they were never mentioned again in history, fulfilling that a couple of the prophecies that we've read about tonight in the book of Obadiah. The only thing that as a nation, there is no longer, as I said earlier, there is no longer an Edomite nation. You can't find a place on the map and say, oh, this is the kingdom of Edom or anything like that. And so because of that, those that survived, the people that were descendants of Esau that survived the attack of Jerusalem, they were dispersed throughout the world. And there are people who have lineage that could be traced, if possible, back to Esau. They would be by blood an Edomite. But as we said, at the day of the Lord, they would be judged just like everybody else who does not have a relationship with God. But the reason we look at these Old Testament prophecies from 2,500, 2,800 years ago is to see how they impact our lives today, how they would impact the way we live and the things that we do. And so we're going to look for just a second at Obadiah for today. Because as I shared a few weeks ago when we talked about this text, Obadiah's book is a lesson on obeying God's command in Genesis chapter 12. See, in Genesis 12, in verses 2 and 3, this is after Abraham is told to leave his home and follow God. He's told this by God. He says, I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you. We know that the reference he makes there to all the peoples on earth will be blessed through Abraham. We understand that is a messianic prophecy referring to Jesus. But we also see the prophecy there that if people bless Abraham's descendants, talking about Israel, the Jews, then God will bless them. If people curse them or are violent towards them or do harm towards them, then God will do the same to them. And so Obadiah is writing these 21 verses that we've looked at tonight. They are that writing and the downfall of many nations, not just the Edomites, shows the truthfulness of God's promise there in Genesis chapter 12. What we see is that God sticks to his word. We see that God fulfills those promises. There's no doubt that God has stuck by that because there is no longer a Roman government who crucified his son, who was a Jew, the Roman government. There is no longer an Assyrian kingdom. There is no longer a Babylonian empire. There is no longer an Edomite group who fought against Israel for all those years. See, the best thing we can do to avoid ending up like Edom and all of these other kingdoms and nations and empires who went against Israel is to elect government officials who will work to support Israel. And we need to pray for Israel. We need to pray for the challenges that they face as the Jewish nation in a very hostile part of the world, because we understand that the tensions between Israelis and Arabs is probably unlike anything we could imagine here in our country. But we do need to pray for the Jews, because hopefully one day before too awfully long we'll have an opportunity to study the book of Revelation, which paints for us a picture of the end times And the Jews, God's chosen people, have a very big place in the end times. And so it's not that God doesn't have anything else to do with them. He has big plans for them. And so we need to do all we can to support them. While we were on our cruise last week, I was watching the news or flipping channels trying to find something to watch at one point. And when I did, I saw that I come across it might have been CNN or one of the news channels. I don't know what it was. I didn't pay much attention. But I just happened to notice that it said that the U.S. is keeping their embassy in Tel Aviv, Israel. And that is a huge thing for our country. It was a little news blurb at the bottom, and it didn't elaborate. Didn't make the big news, and they didn't discuss it or anything like that. But that is huge when it comes to our understanding of Genesis chapter 12 and God saying, He's going to bless those who bless Israel. By the fact that we are keeping our embassy in Israel, that means that we are keeping up dialogue with the nation of Israel. It means that we are there to continue to support and work politically and economically with the people of Israel. And therefore, the current administration that we have in the White House is looking to continue a relationship with the people of Israel. For our country, that is a very good thing for us to understand, because God says He's going to bless those who bless Israel. And by doing that, that helps us to benefit the people of Israel, but it also gives them an opportunity to benefit us economically and politically and all of that. And so we need to do all we can to support Israel, unless we want to be humbled like Edom for bringing those curses and violence against Israel by withdrawing our support from Israel. So it's important that we pray for Israel and pray for Jerusalem and for the Jews that live in that region of the world. And so that is our study of the book of Obadiah. And so it was one chapter, so we were able to get it done in one shot, so to speak.